As the player progresses through the game, the sheer scale of Gruntilda's lair starts to become more apparent, and I feel that the lair itself is deserving of a fair amount of praise. Banjo-Kazooie takes a concept that may have been little more than a menu in other games and makes it into something that feels as much a part of the game as each individual level does. Perhaps the biggest means by which the game sets itself apart in this regard are its borrowing of the design philosophy of its levels, and its creation of a looming sense of danger and hostility. The former is accomplished by the separation of level entrances and the respective puzzles that open them. This structure adds a slight element of puzzle solving and exploration to what would normally be a simple traversal from one level to another. I appreciate the effort to make the hub feel like a level of its own, when it would have been far easier and more conventional to simply have a bunch of portals placed around Spiral Mountain and have the lair itself serve as a final level with a boss at the end. While many games might use the hub as a safe haven between levels, Banjo-Kazooie runs with the concept of an openly hostile hub world, filling it with various enemies and hazards. The use of danger in the lair makes the entire experience feel much more cohesive, as the lair provides a sharp decrease in difficulty between the levels, but the threat of damage or even death is still always present. Although dying in the lair is practically a triviality, these elements still contribute to a distinct atmosphere that the game would be lesser without. It's also in these segments within the lair that one of my favorite tertiary aspects of Banjo-Kazooie's design comes to light, the characterization of the antagonist, Gruntilda the Witch. Although not a particularly deep character, I don't feel it's a stretch to say that Grunty is easily among the most amusing and best presented antagonists ever featured in a platforming game. In fact, I would even place her above many antagonists in games that focus far more on plot than Banjo-Kazooie does, and my reason for this is simple. The game conveys her character in ways that are totally unobtrusive to the core gameplay. The best example of this is the lair itself. Aside from being hers in name, the player is repeatedly bombarded with aesthetic choices that show off Grunty's personality. Visual monuments of Grunty fill the first half of the lair, and her distinctive cackle can be heard in every version of the lair's music. As a result, it's unmistakable that Grunty is both immensely narcissistic and dangerously powerful. But things don't stop there. While the player is in the lair, dialogue from Grunty will appear at random intervals, almost always a jeering taunt of the protagonists or a self-aggrandizing quip, all of which are in the form of rhyming couplets. What impresses me most is just how varied these bits of text are. Despite spending over an hour and a half in the lair, I never saw a single repetition of any of this dialogue, and though it's entirely possible I was just lucky, this lack of repetition goes a long way in making the game more believable. Grunty is also heard throughout the levels, enthusiastically informing the player of hazards as they're damaged by them, and occasionally even mocking them after they've died. This is an extremely effective way to characterize an antagonist, as it constantly reinforces the idea that Grunty is actively working against Banjo and Kazooie, and by extension, the player. But the most important part of all of this is that it never interrupts the game to do so. This is the kind of seamless characterization that most games can only dream of achieving, and Banjo-Kazooie pulls it off effortlessly. The game makes use of only 4 gameplay-arresting story cutscenes throughout its entirety, which amount to less than 7.5 minutes in total length. But Gruntilda ends up being extremely memorable and engaging despite this. It's difficult to overstate just how much she adds to the game, not merely as a final boss or an antagonist, but as a solid character and an irreplaceable part of its story. The latter half of the game sees an interesting shift in the overall structure of levels. Whereas the first half of the game primarily consisted of large, mostly contiguous worlds, the second half of the game trends toward a much greater use of discrete sections separated by loading zones. Mad Monster Mansion and Rusty Bucket Bay in particular make extensive use of this design, with Click Clock Wood ending up somewhere in between the two styles. This structure benefits the game by allowing levels to contain more content while constraining the layout to a reasonable size, effectively compressing the level. I imagine memory was also a concern, considering just how large these levels end up being when factoring in all the different subsections. Throughout the last few levels, the difficulty curve continues to rise somewhat linearly. What's interesting is that each of these levels introduces difficulty through different means. Mad Monster Mansion focuses on its use of enemies, such as ghosts that can phase through walls and who can only be killed with the invincibility technique. Rusty Bucket Bay's oily water drains the player's air even on the surface. It also features the only bottomless pit in any of the main levels, in one of the most tense platforming sections in the game. Click Clock Wood uses its verticality to introduce difficulty by way of the game's surprisingly unforgiving fall damage. The fact that the player has to climb the tree at least 3 times makes this even more significant. In all, these levels make for a surprisingly engrossing challenge, though they do bring one of the more contentious aspects of Banjo-Kazooie's design to the forefront. That aspect is the lack of note retention upon death or leaving a level. To understand what impact it has on the game, we should first examine exactly what purpose the notes serve. Their primary role is to provide a reasonable limit to the player's progress through the lair in the form of the note doors. In this manner, the note doors serve as useful barriers that feel very organic rather than arbitrary. Adding to this feeling is the manner in which notes are placed within the levels. For the most part, notes are never really out of the way, and are in fact often used to line walkways and platforms, leading the player in a manner similar to coins in the Mario games. As a result, their placement almost always feels quite natural, and even with 100 of them spread across every level, it's surprising how infrequently it feels like a chore to seek them out. More often than not, a player will simply happen across a group of them while moving about the level, providing an immediate reward for traversing and exploring the game world, as the worth of the notes is established early on and reinforced with each bit of progress the player makes. The notes are an effective mechanic to solve the problem of the lair's size by limiting access to it in parts, while complementing the game's open level design. So why reset them upon dying and upon leaving the level? The answer to the former is obvious and is the best argument for this feature's inclusion. In every video game past the time of arcades, stakes for player death have been more or less non-existent, and effectively meaningless when present at all. Generally, a death amounts to replaying a portion of a level, or some other mechanic that punishes the player simply in terms of lost time. Banjo-Kazooie, through its lack of note retention after death, creates extremely high stakes, to the point that there were even a few times in my most recent playthrough where I felt a sense of genuine tension in the presence of enemies and other hazards that would normally not even register for me. In this regard, Banjo-Kazooie manages to accomplish something that many games even today cannot, adding a real sense of weight to death and failure. Although one could argue that it ultimately amounts to the same kind of time penalty I just described, I feel it's deeper than that because collecting notes isn't necessarily integral to progress through the level. The game takes away a tangible marker of achievement when it resets the notes, and the player might take up the challenge of recollecting everything again, but can still continue the game without doing so in most cases. The obvious downside to this is the potential of frustrating the player when a death does occur, as well as the fact that this penalty becomes more severe the longer the player spends collecting notes. The threat of taking away notes makes death more significant, but the punishment is perhaps too harsh, as collecting notes for a second time will never be quite as fulfilling, and can be extremely time-consuming in the later levels. Resetting notes upon death seems to make some intuitive sense, but the decision to reset notes when the player leaves a level seems a bit less clearly motivated, and perhaps even arbitrary. Some aspects of Banjo-Kazooie's design clash heavily with this idea. The most obvious example of this is the interdependence of moves between Gobi's Valley and Freezeezy Peak. Each of these levels are impossible to fully complete without a move learned in the other. Although players who visit Freezeezy Peak first only miss out on a single Jiggy, those that visit Gobi's Valley first may very well complete the entire level, only to find that several notes are completely out of reach. At this point, the game effectively rubs salt in the wound by forcing them to reset all the notes they've collected when they leave. The sheer size and complexity of the later levels also poses a problem. If a player needs or wants to leave the game in the middle of a play session, they end up losing some of their progress through no fault of their own. The likelihood of this occurring increases in the later levels, as they can take a much larger chunk of time to complete. The fact that this can occur at all is a serious oversight. As much as I personally like the tension and stakes that the lack of note retention creates, the fact of the matter is that it detracts much more than it adds for most players, and ends up being one of the larger flaws in Banjo-Kazooie's design. Its removal in the Xbox Live Arcade port of the game certainly seems to speak to that conclusion. Although I've spent a good deal talking about mechanics so far, I've neglected to cover one of Banjo-Kazooie's all-around strongest assets, and that asset is its sound design. As one might expect from a game where both of the protagonists are named after musical instruments, sound plays a large part in Banjo-Kazooie. Perhaps most memorably, in lieu of voice acting, small gibberish voice clips accompany text-based dialogue. This serves to give every character a distinct personality without the risk of dating the game with poor voice acting, especially when the limited space on N64 cartridges would have severely limited the amount of dialogue that could be recorded. By the end of the game, Banjo and Kazooie have a fairly wide array of moves, and every single one has a distinct sound or combination of sounds associated with it. The distinction between these sounds provides useful feedback to the player by complementing the visual feedback of the animations. Sound is also used to alert the player to the presence of enemies, with nearly every enemy using some form of sound to indicate that they've spotted Banjo or are attacking. The projectile-throwing snowmen are a particularly good example of this, as they use a variety of sound effects depending on the distance between the projectile and Banjo. The sound effects of the snowball being made and thrown are always heard, but a whooshing sound effect also plays if the snowball is within a certain range of Banjo, and typically only when it comes into view. The player's ability to anticipate the presence of enemies even when they're not visible comes naturally. In short, the game's use of sound effects speaks to the emphasis the designers placed on the sound design as a functional gameplay element rather than mere aesthetic dressing. The high quality of Banjo-Kazooie's sound design goes beyond its use of sound effects, however. The game's use of music and ambience is rather sophisticated, and could even be called ambitious for its time. Perhaps the most notable and immediately memorable aspect of Banjo-Kazooie's score is its use of MIDI channel fading to dynamically change the background music throughout each level. This is used to introduce a bit of variance in the audio without the need for a discrete loading zone or even so much as a pause in the music, and in this regard it certainly succeeds. The theme that plays in Gruntilda's lair fades into an alternate instrumentation suiting each level as the player approaches each level puzzle and level entrance. Treasure Trove Cove's music fades away altogether to a quiet ambience as the player ascends to its highest point, highlighting their altitude. Rusty Bucket Bay's music incorporates 3 distinctive steam whistle sounds, but mutes them in the area where the player has to use the same sounds to solve a puzzle. However, its utility is deeper than simply adding variety, and one use of it strikes me as particularly clever. When the player dives underwater, the current song's instrumentation is reduced to a single harp. A slightly muffled reverb conveys the feeling of being underwater, but the important part of this design aspect is that it's the same across every level. This is a very simple and effective way to musically unify a game that covers many environments and genres. Nearly all of the levels, regardless as to their tone or aesthetic, find a common musical ground in the understated, soft feeling of their aquatic variations. The game's occasional sectioning of its levels into smaller areas gives another opportunity for the music to shine. Despite these sections being quite small, almost every one of them receives its own music, or a separate arrangement of the main level theme. Mad Monster Mansion is of particular note as it has 6 different versions of its song across its 12 subsections. This is a noteworthy amount of effort to keep things varied, and it speaks to the developer's foresight that even a strong composition can lose a lot of its luster when it's heard too much. Much as I'd like to offer some criticism of the game's music, I simply can't think of any. Even its worst tunes, comparatively speaking, are better than average as far as video game music goes, and I can't recall any moment where the music detracted from the game in any way whatsoever. In fact, its music succeeds not only in complementing the aesthetic of all of its levels, but its composition speaks to a deeper thematic intention that some might argue was uncommon for video game music at the time. Specifically, the deliberate and extensive use of tritones, or notes that are 6 semitones apart on the chromatic scale. This distance between the notes creates a strong dissonance, and according to the game's composer, Grant Kirkhope, this dissonance was meant to represent the stark contrast between the game's 2 protagonists. Tritones are even present in the title theme, arguably the Banjo series' most prevalent melody, within the opening banjo riff, which itself is likely ingrained in the minds of most who have played a Banjo-Kazooie game. The game's score is fondly remembered for its high quality regardless, but this level of care and attention to detail again highlights just how central the concept of sound is to Banjo-Kazooie as a whole, and how well executed its sound design is overall. It's a game that truly deserves a deeper analysis of its entire score, but to do it justice would require far more knowledge of music theory than I currently have. Hopefully, this basic look has conveyed just how much of a success the game is in this regard. After what seems to be the final note door has been opened, the player finds themselves in Grunty's Furnace Fun, an elaborate trivia board game. Although I do have my complaints about this section of the game, I think it represents one of the biggest twists in terms of core gameplay in possibly any game of the era, and for the most part, it's pulled off extremely well. Instead of creating a climactic final level for the player to complete, which would have been quite a difficult task in Banjo-Kazooie's open-world style, the developers managed to create a truly unique challenge, and something that's perhaps more fitting than any such final level could be. The more the player has embraced the game's focus on exploration and discovery, the more prepared they'll be for Furnace Fun. I don't think there's any way a suitable final level could be built around the same idea while not feeling totally out of sync with the rest of the game. The game also takes this time to play upon and further Gruntilda's characterization. Her role as the host lends itself to a lot of dialogue, which gives ample opportunity for this to happen, but it's striking to me how subtle some of this is. When she asks the player to identify a character by the sound effect used for their voice, she asks, which character has this dumb voice? However, if the voice clip in question happens to be her own, she replaces the word dumb with cool. This is admittedly a very minor touch, and one that might even be missed entirely by many players, but these minor touches in aggregate are what give the game and its characters their distinctive personalities, and are a huge factor in what makes Banjo-Kazooie's presentation so charming and enjoyable. Despite Furnace Fun's fairly strong execution, it definitely has a few disappointing aspects. Easily the worst parts are the death squares, which instantly kill the player if the corresponding question is answered incorrectly, forcing them to start the entire board over again. Adding to this frustration is the fact that the questions for a death square can be from any category, including Grunty questions, which are themselves the second worst addition to Furnace Fun. As the player progresses through the lair, they encounter Grunty's sister Bruntilda as many as 10 times. Each time she's found, she provides 3 facts about Grunty, which are in actuality the answers to the Grunty questions in Furnace Fun. Although this seems to fit well with the game's emphasis on thorough exploration, the problem here comes in 2 forms. First is the fact that players will have to memorize upwards of 20 of these answers in order to have even a 2 in 3 chance of getting a question that they can answer with certainty. Much worse is the fact that the answers to these questions are randomized each time a new file is started, meaning that players that have played the game before will still have to seek out Bruntilda and memorize an entirely new set of answers each time they replay the game. This is a truly needless diversion, and I speak from experience when I say there's nothing quite as frustrating as getting an unknown Grunty question on a death square halfway through the board. Even players making an effort to complete as much as possible may have to rely on blind luck in these situations, which is truly unfortunate given how novel and well executed an idea Furnace Fun is otherwise. After Furnace Fun has been completed, the player is treated to a false ending of sorts, complete with credits and an ending cutscene, only for Tootie to interrupt the festivities and somewhat viciously prompt Banjo to return to the lair to battle Gruntilda. Once the player regains control, they're confronted with the most serious design flaw in the entire game: a sudden and unexpected reveal of the game's linearity. This comes first in the form of the final mandatory note door, which requires 810 of the game's 900 notes to open. This means that all 9 levels must be unlocked, a task which in turn requires the expense of 69 of the game's 100 jiggies. Once the player is past this, they're met with an even larger obstacle: a final portrait puzzle requiring a further 25 jiggies to open the final battle. Because all of the levels have to have been opened by this point, this means that players must collect 94 of the 100 jiggies in the game in order to complete it. I don't think it's a stretch to say that even players that do want to collect most of the jiggies might miss a few, and the fact that only 6 of them can be missed or skipped in the entire game doesn't quite ring true to me. For players without a burning desire to collect everything in the game, these final roadblocks are potentially an absolute nightmare. For a game that up to this point seemed to be content in letting the player explore and complete tasks as they pleased, this sudden shift toward outright completionism is almost inexcusable, especially considering the immense amount of build-up leading to the final confrontation. This tense atmosphere is hugely undercut for all but the most adamant of new players, as most will be forced to unceremoniously turn back and scour old levels for more jiggies and notes. I can't fault the developers for wanting to present a non-trivial final challenge to overcome before the final boss, but I wish that the game didn't spring it on the player so suddenly and so close to the end. It would have been a far better idea to have the portrait unlock the door to Furnace Fun instead, so that the final act of the game could proceed in a more exciting and uninterrupted manner. This would have also made Furnace Fun a bit more fair by guaranteeing that players had experienced a larger amount of the game beforehand. The final battle with Gruntilda serves as an appropriately climactic cap-off to the experience. The variety of attack methods and Grunty's changing of tactics across its different phases makes the fight feel much more dynamic compared to many other video game bosses of its time. In addition, it's immensely gratifying to finally confront and battle the antagonist that's been taunting the player from off-screen the entire game. Its difficulty might be a little too steep for most, as Grunty's attacks increase in speed and accuracy while demanding the player stand still more often to fire eggs. The presence of an attack that never misses doesn't help matters, nor does the fact that the player can easily be knocked off the battlements by hit stun. The final phase of the fight also suffers from a diminished feeling of impact, as the player is simply activating statues that attack Grunty for them, with these attacks usually landing off-screen. This is largely rectified by the very satisfying cutscene that plays upon activating the final statue. Grunty's sheer tenacity as an antagonist also shines one last time, as even as she falls from the tower, she attempts a final parting shot, complete with another rhyming couplet. The game ends with a brief cutscene on a beach, followed by a brief tease at the upcoming release of the game's own sequel, which is amusingly unique if nothing else. Grunty, now buried under a large boulder in Spiral Mountain, promises to get her revenge, and the game fades out on a pleasant note, although there are a few minor differences if the player hasn't collected all 100 Jiggies. Banjo-Kazooie is a game that's difficult to dislike. With its storybook aesthetic, endearing cast of characters, and strong level design complementing solid movement mechanics, it's not hard to see why. It's certainly not perfect, however, with some conveyance and pacing issues of varying magnitude, and a few extremely questionable design decisions. Its levels aren't flawless either, with Clanker's Cavern in particular feeling much slower and more aimless than the rest of the game. I've never been one to tout that a game deserves special credit simply for being the first of its kind. Luckily enough, Banjo-Kazooie doesn't need any consideration in that regard, as it manages to simultaneously establish and set a fairly high standard for so-called collectathon platformers. This is especially noteworthy considering the time of Banjo-Kazooie's release. Even 2 years after Super Mario 64, the novelty of moving about a colorful 3D world was still somewhat fresh, and it's likely the game could have succeeded on that alone. The fact that it clearly shows so much polish and an effort to deepen its gameplay beyond that novelty is possibly its most impressive feature, and is the biggest factor in leading me to believe that the praise it receives is well deserved. Ultimately, Banjo-Kazooie's appeal boils down to a single, crucial, and obvious principle of game design. If the player is going to do a lot of something, that something should be as fun and satisfying as possible. In this case, it's the game's movement, which works in tandem with the game's levels, and almost always operates at the pace the player desires. Add some excellent visuals, fantastic music and sound, and a charming, well-presented story, and it's pretty difficult to go wrong. In my next video, I'll be looking at the expansive and sometimes daunting world of Banjo-Tooie. Thanks for watching.